What if I told you that your ability to reason doesn't just come from your physical brain? Dr. Michael Egnor, in his book, The Immortal Mind, talks about how, as a world-class neurosurgeon, he did 7,000 brain surgeries, and what happened changed everything. And it's not because of his upbringing, but because the science might be saying something about the soul. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Mike Egnor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alan. It's a real privilege to be here.
Could you tell us what got you started on even writing a book?
Sure. Well, I'm a neurosurgeon, and I am on faculty at the State University of New York at Stony Brook in Long Island. And I started out my life as an atheist. I was brought up in a non-religious home, really. I never had any antipathy to Christianity. I thought it was a lovely idea. I just didn't think it was true. And I fell in love with science as a kid, and I wanted to be a doctor, and I wanted to study the brain. And so I went to medical school. I loved neuroscience and neuroanatomy and neurophysiology, and trained as a neurosurgeon at the University of Miami, and began practicing at Stony Brook in 1991 on faculty at the medical school. I came to see in my work that what I had been led to believe as a materialist and as an atheist, that the mind is strictly the product of the brain, that it just comes out of the brain and there's no such thing as a human soul, just isn't true. And I've seen that in my neurosurgical practice. I've done over 7,000 brain operations. I've been doing this for about 45 years.
Can we just talk about even 7,000 plus surgeries? How often does a neurosurgeon reach that amount of surgeries? Is that pretty high up there, I'm assuming?
It's pretty common. It's pretty common. If you do, the average neurosurgeon probably does between 150 and 200 operations a year. And if you practice for 40 years, if you add it all up, that's about what it comes to.
So as far as the conversation of your conversion, how hard was it to let go of being a materialist?
Well, it actually turned out to be a lot easier than I thought, because it's a lot easier to stop telling a lie and start telling the truth. It's that truth is actually fairly easy. Even in college, I would learn about, for example, the Krebs cycle, which is a biochemical process in the body that helps produce energy and so on. And reading about this, I got to thinking, well, how did this just happen by chance? How do you get all of this just incredible, beautiful systems in the body, and the way DNA works and all that stuff? And then you look at cosmology, you look at the Big Bang, you look at the fine tuning of the universe. You look at the human mind and human consciousness, and you say, this all just happened by chance or by natural selection? And natural selection really isn't much better than chance. It's chance events, and then whatever survives, survives. And so I had questions about it, but I thought when I was younger that, well, science has proven this. This is all proven and so on. And I came to realize, as I read about it more and studied it more, that the Darwinian way of understanding the world and the materialist atheist way of understanding the world is not at all proven. It's actually really bad science. It's junk science, and it's just what you're supposed to say. It's the cultural trend, and I decided to buck the cultural trend and search for the truth. And when you search for the truth is God, and God explains everything. He explains the mind. He explains the Big Bang. He explains DNA. He explains the incredible way that our body works. He explains the joy and the beauty and the love that we have in life. He accounts for everything.
I'm going to do this in 10 seconds. If you want more bonus resources for this and every episode and early access to all future Science Dilemma series, go to our website for more information. That's it. I got 1 second. Yeah. Did you get much pushback on that journey? Like when you were doing, just as you were transitioning into not being a materialist, were you still getting pushback, or were you super vocal yet?
Well, I didn't get much pushback in my personal life. I was fortunate. First of all, I'm very fortunate that my day job is as a doctor, so I sort of just get paid for doing what I'm doing. And whereas I think if I were a pure research scientist, it would be very hard for me. And I actually have friends who are very prominent research scientists, prominent nationally, who've told me privately that they totally agree with me. They're very devout Christians, but they dare not say a word in public. Is that if well, like one guy told me, and he's one of the world's experts on brain science, said if I ever publicly said that I support intelligent design or I support dualism, the belief that we have a soul, said I'd never get another grant. That would be the end of my career. And he said my wife is ill and she needs health insurance. I'd lose my insurance because nobody would ever pay me again.
And that's just if he held a personal view there, like he wasn't even inputting it into his research, he would still get ousted just because of
Oh
that.
yeah, absolutely. And So it's very hard to buck this. The bias out there and just the pure viciousness is pretty incredible.
I've heard your story. I think that it's awesome, and I'd love to talk about some of the surgical stories that you have of what got this idea of the immortal mind, or why you believe or started to believe in the soul. Could we discuss
Sure,
a little bit of
sure.
that? Just okay,
Well,
cool.
when I was in medical school, I studied neuroanatomy, the detailed anatomy of the brain and all the fascinating stuff. So I got out into practice and I started seeing patients, for example, a little girl who was born with about 2/3 of her brain missing. It was just replaced by water. And I was pretty certain that she wasn't going to do well. I mean, how could you possibly be a normal human being like that? So I spoke to her family and I told them I'm sorry, but I can't give them a good prognosis. And I followed her as she grew up, and she's now in her 20s, and she's a very bright, normal young lady, and she's doing beautifully. Now, not everybody who has a brain problem when they're born does well, but there was nothing in my textbooks that explained this. There's nothing in the materialist way of looking at the brain that could account for this. And I had a number of other patients. I had a patient who was missing major parts of her brain that was a gifted student in school and went on to be a published musician and has a master's degree in English literature. Um,
When you say major, can I'm sorry
sure,
for interrupting,
sure.
but I'm not a brain
Yeah,
surgeon.
that's right.
So when you say major part of the brain, is it like the average doctor would have assumed that she wouldn't be functioning the way that she was? Like
Precisely,
what?
precisely. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if you show, for example, the baby I referred to first, if you showed her scan, and I don't have it here, but it's actually in the book. We have her MRI scan there. The average neurosurgeon would say that she would be basically a vegetable, to use a kind of a callous term. But if you met her, she's a bright, vivacious person. Her mom says she's too smart for her own good.
And is there any scientific explanation for this, or is
Well,
that where?
the traditional explanation that would be offered is that her brain what was left of her brain was able to adapt and develop new pathways, and to some extent that might be true, but I saw so much of this. This is so common, and one thing that really kind of tipped me over on this was there's a kind of a brain surgery called awake brain surgery, where we operate on people's brains when they're fully awake. We use local anesthesia like Novocaine, so that doesn't cause any pain. And
So their eyes are open, they're breathing, they're like
they're
conscious.
talking, yeah, sure, sure. And the reason we do this, and it's not common, but I've done it a number of times, and my colleagues do it. And Dr. Penfield, the neurosurgeon I mentioned earlier, did 1,100 patients with this. The reason for it is that some people have problems in their brain where you have to remove a section of the brain because it has a tumor in it, or because the section is causing seizures. And there are vital areas of the brain that are right next to it, and you have to know what's vital and what's not. And so you can map the brain by stimulating the surface of the brain, find out, for example, this particular patient, she had a tumor in her left temporal or left frontal lobe, and her speech area was like very close to where the tumor was. So when I was taking out the area of her brain that had the tumor to try to cure the tumor, I had to make sure I didn't interfere with her speech because it could have left her unable to speak. So as I was operating, I was stimulating and testing her brain just to make sure that I wasn't damaging her speech. So I'm operating and we're talking, and we the operation lasted several hours, and I'm having this conversation with her as I'm removing major parts of the left frontal lobe of her brain, and she was perfectly okay. It didn't affect her at all, and she made excellent recovery. And I was thinking, well, that's not in any textbook. I mean, goodness gracious, that's not anywhere. So, and other neurosurgeons have had the same experience. In fact, we refer to the brain as having two different kinds of areas. One kind of area is called eloquent brain. An eloquent brain is a part of the brain that you absolutely need. If you don't have it, you've got terrible problems. Non-eloquent brain is brain that you don't really need, and you can remove, and a person can be perfectly normal. And not the idea that there are parts of your brain that you can take out or have missing and be okay is not really in the textbooks. So it just got me to questioning all of this, and I started looking at the scientific research. I looked at philosophy of mind. I looked at religious philosophy, and it became clear to me that the conventional Christian way of understanding the human soul, which is called Thomistic dualism, after St. Thomas Aquinas, who was a Christian theologian, philosopher in the 13th century, that his way of understanding the soul and the mind actually fit the science better than the modern textbooks do. So
How so?
um,
How did
what Aquinas said was that there were certain powers of the mind that did not come from the brain itself. He said that the capacity for human reason, for example, is a spiritual power. It's not a power that comes from the brain. Ordinarily, you need decent function of the brain to properly use reason, but reason doesn't come from the brain. And so the idea that we're kind of a mixture of a body, which we clearly are, we have a lot of very physical aspects of ourselves, but that our souls are spiritual and we're created in God's image, and the spiritual part of us is a very important part of us. And the main thing the spiritual part does is two things. It gives us the capacity for reason, the capacity to form concepts, the capacity to understand things on a deep level, the capacity to worship God. Also, it gives us free will. It gives us the ability to make moral choices based on judgment of moral right and wrong. And that doesn't come from the brain. That's a separate thing. That's what St. Thomas Aquinas said, and that's what I've seen in the way the brain works and the way the mind works. Some of the research that's been done on this was done by Dr. Penfield, and he did 1,100 operations where he tried to stimulate from the brain the capacity for reason. And he found that he couldn't do it. No matter where he stimulated the brain, he couldn't make a person do any reasoning. He couldn't make a person do mathematics or do logic or worship God or anything like that. He could make people move their limbs. He can make people have sensations. He can make people have memories, and he can make people have emotions, but he could never make the intellect, reason, and free will. So he concluded, after hundreds of thousands of individual stimulations of people's brains, that the intellect didn't come from the brain, which is a perfectly reasonable inference. That's good science. And when we made this argument in the research paper that we submitted to the philosophy journal, we got incredible pushback where they said, well, he didn't use the right experimental setup, and blah, blah, blah. Well, I mean, you can make that argument, except he did it hundreds of thousands of times, and he never got a single response from the brain that was reasoning. And he's one of the greatest neuroscientists of all time. We ought to take him seriously. This is not something that you just brush off. So basically, what we face with the materialists who deny the reality of the human spiritual soul is that they try to use bluster. They try to bring up pseudo-scientific kinds of ideas, and when that doesn't work, they simply deny it. They just say, well, that's all just this nonsense. But they don't really have very good arguments.
I have one, it's a curious question for me. Have you seen people around you convert from you just explaining stuff like the immortal mind? Like
It's
what impacts
it's a
have you
good
seen?
question. It's a good question. I can't say that I've seen anyone convert. I certainly hope that they have, but I do think what I've seen, which is very important, is that, and it's true of me in some sense, is that I've always been open to Christianity. As I said, even when I was an atheist, I thought Christians were really nice people, and I thought Christianity was just a lovely idea. I just thought it was a myth. And so what I want to convey to people, there are people who hate Christianity and who hate God. They're hard to reach in some ways, although even there you can reach them. But the people I really want to reach are people who love Christianity but can't quite bring themselves to take it seriously enough. And I want to let them know that you don't have to leave your brain at the door, meaning that the greatest science, the greatest logic, the greatest reasoning is in a Christian context. That's where the deep wisdom is. And it makes you a better scientist. It makes you better at anything you do.
Yeah, you're not making science have to fit within the scriptural framework. You're just looking at both the scriptural framework and looking at science and saying, hey, stuff's matching up.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
it matches up beautifully. There was actually a famous cosmologist or scientist who won the Nobel Prize in physics. He helped discover the background radiation from the Big Bang, and he commented one time. He said, "You know, when I look at all that I've learned about cosmology, the origin of the universe, the Big Bang," said it was all in Genesis. It was all in Let There Be Light. Said it all, so I think the Bible teaches deep, profound truths. You have to be able to interpret it. You have to understand what it's saying, but everything in it is true. And I read it every day, and I'm astonished at the wisdom and the truth that God's word holds.
What do you say to those of us that are just lay people but still want to understand and learn?
The Christian way of looking at the world frees you up to see the truth, and it's made me a much better scientist, made me a much better doctor, and I didn't really begin to see the truth until I saw Christ.
Well, thank you so much, sir, for joining us today on the Science Dilemma podcast.
Thank you, Alan. It's a real privilege. God bless you.
God bless you.
God bless you too. Bye-bye.
If you're anything like me, this episode blew your mind. I mean, reason, free will, consciousness. Dr. Egnor's real-life cases showed that they don't just depend on the physical brain, and that it's not theology, it's evidence. And I know that you know somebody who needs to listen to this, because they need to know that they're more than just material, they're more than just matter. And so go ahead and share this with them and support the Science Dilemma podcast by liking, subscribing wherever you're listening. And if you'd like to, joining our community. We'll see you on the next episode.